So good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Elon Berman. I am the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council. And the subject of the webinar today is the topic of Islamism in North and West Africa. Some of you may have joined us for our inaugural session last month when we explored the state of the Islamic State and the past, present, and likely future of the world's most notorious terrorist group. Today's topic is a little bit different. Last month, we focused almost exclusively on the hard side of things. Today, we're going to talk about both. We're going to talk about violent extremism, and we're going to talk about participationist Islamist religious politics and how they're shaping the contours of one of the world's most critical regions. This is the second in a series of webinars that we're doing to take a look at the changing nature of the struggle against Islamic extremism and the nature of the phenomenon itself. As sort of by way of introduction, this installment and sort of the webinar series as a whole is closely tied to our World Almanac of Islamism project. For those of you that aren't familiar with it or might not be, the Almanac is one of our keystone initiatives. It is a scholarly resource, both in print and on the web, that's designed to track trends in political Islam over time. It's an effort that we've administered for nearly a decade, and we are next month, in November, closing out our 2021 edition. And we're sort of enormously excited to sort of be able to bring you that. Many of the chapters of the collection are already available digitally on the Almanac website. With the address is almanac.afpc.org. And I encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to visit the Almanac online and explore it for yourselves. When you do, what you'll see is that the Almanac is truly a sort of a gargantuan effort. It brings together dozens of world-class scholars from the US and abroad to give it what we hope is a truly global look at the phenomenon of political Islam and Islamism. And so I'm delighted that three of those scholars have accepted my invitation to be here today to discuss the Islamist phenomenon as it affects Africa. So let me introduce them in turn. Ophir Winter is a research fellow at Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Strategic Studies, INSS, and a lecturer at the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Tel Aviv University. Emily Estelle is the research manager for the American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project. She's also a senior Al-Qaeda analyst and the project's Africa team lead. And Jacob Zen is a fellow at the Jamestown Foundation in Washington and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program. Guys, thank you so much for being with me today. And parenthetically, I would say that the silver lining of doing a digital webinar is that I have a chance to bring the three of you together because we're all in different time zones right now. Jacob is in Asia, Ophir's in the Middle East. Emily is in the Midwest. So the fact that we can do this on a digital platform does have its benefits, even though I would very much love to see you all in person, and I hope we're able to do that soon. So before we get started, just another administrative note for all of our audience participants. As you'll see, the chat function for all attendees has been disabled. If you have a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A feature that you should be able to find at the bottom of your screens, and I'll curate the questions and I'll ask them of the speakers. In our last webinar, the one we did last month, we had a little bit of a glitch with the Q&A function. If that ends up becoming the case, I'll enable the chat function. You'll be able to ask the questions that way to the panelists. Finally, I find that rather than having canned speeches, having more of a conversation allows for sort of a freer flow of discussion. And so we've structured our webinars that way. What you'll hear and what you'll see, I think, hopefully is going to be sort of a very edifying conversation instead of a canned speech about the phenomenon and about how it affects Africa. So without further ado, let me jump in here. Let me ask the first question to Ophir because I'd like to start with Egypt. So over the last decade, Egypt has undergone a massive transformation from a secular order to a religious one and back again, with some variations. So what's the current political balance in Egypt today, and how do Islamists figure into national politics? Are they the enemies of the state? Are they partners of the state? Are they something in between? Can you help us understand?
Thank you very much, Ilan. Hello from Israel, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to the event. It's a real pleasure to be part of such a distinguished panel. And to your question, when I analyze the religious political scene in Egypt, I don't think we should speak of Islamists versus seculars, but rather of four main groups, which all perceive themselves as loyal Muslims. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, which operates today mostly outside Egypt, the Salafi jihadist, ISIS-affiliated Sinai province that still poses a major terrorist threat in northern Sinai, the political Salafists, such as the Nur Party, who became, following 2011, the second largest political force in the parliament after the Brotherhood, but lost much of its popularity since then. And finally, the official religious establishment of the state, including Al-Azhar, the Mufti, and the Ministry of Endowments, which is the most powerful Islamic actor on the ground, sponsored by the Egyptian government. The regime's hand is now on top, while political Islam lost its traditional main source of power, namely its efficient organization based on a network of social, educational, and health services. I think the regime is on the top. The July 2013 revolution, or coup, whatever you call it, constituted and still is a huge setback for the Muslim brothers. It took them more than 8 decades to reach power and get to the implementation phase of their Islamist project. However, as we all know, they were forced to step down in only 1 year. And since 2013, the Egyptian authorities have launched a massive crackdown on the organization in an attempt to eradicate it from the political scene. The Muslim Brotherhood has been legally designated as a terrorist organization. All its businesses and assets providing the social services were seized and all its activities banned. Most of its senior and mid-level leaders and even thousands of low-level activists, as we know, have been put behind bars, exiled, or even killed. Inside Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization is almost non-existent today and has been reduced to a divided, weak, fragmented entity with its open dawah activism banned. The Muslim Brotherhood is unable today to influence younger age groups at universities, for example. It lacks sufficient human and financial resources and infrastructures needed for promoting activities. The organization on the ground is basically ineffective. The exiled, mostly middle-level leadership has little control over its members in Egypt. There are no functioning chains of command. For example, when Morsi died in prison in June 2019, the Brotherhood called for enacting mass symbolic funerals, but people stayed home, probably due to fear of crackdown, as well as a widespread decline in the Brotherhood's popular support. In the same way, they failed time after time in mobilizing Egyptian people for mass protests against the regime. Most recently last month, the very few protests we saw in Egypt last September focused on social and economic local affairs rather than calling for what we may call Islamist revolution. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood still aspires to serve as a future political alternative. Furthermore, the supporters of the ideas of the Brotherhood still make up a significant segment of the Egyptian society. According to a Washington Institute poll in 2018, the Brotherhood enjoys a somewhat positive opinion among about 1/3 of the Egyptian population. Additionally, the brothers outside Egypt, mainly in Turkey and Qatar, still possess effective media tools, including satellite channels, news outlets, and even a think tank. Hence, it's fair to assume that the brothers' traditional base of support has not totally disappeared.
All right, Ophir, that's a great introduction. I want to follow up on that, and sort of when we do our next round, I'm going to follow up on that. But sort of for the moment, I want to shift focus slightly to the West and ask Emily a question. Emily, you're a specialist in all things Africa, but in particular, Libya and the Libyan civil war. It's a conflict that's now in its sixth year, and it's something that's enormously misunderstood or underappreciated, I think, even in the policy community in the United States, but certainly in terms of a lack of understanding among observers in the West. Can you outline the main dynamics of the conflict that are taking place there now and how religion figures into this mix?
Sure, I'll do my best because everyone who follows Libya knows just how complicated the situation is. So Libya is extremely fragmented, whether you're looking at the security sphere, politics, religion. That makes it also an interesting crossroads of different kinds of Islamism that are themselves changing or in flux in that environment. To give a very, very broad brush overview of the conflict, there are two main coalitions, very diverse in and of themselves, descended from a split that started this round of the civil war in 2014. Now, there are a lot of binaries that get applied to these coalitions, and I have to simplify a bit to discuss them, but I'll note that they kind of defy any simple categorization. Based in the east is the coalition that generally includes Khalifa Haftar's forces, which he calls the Libyan National Army, and a range of other political and military players. I'll set aside for now Haftar's own role and how much influence he may or may not retain, because that's also its own discussion. But this is the coalition that's generally termed anti-Islamist. For the leadership and main backers, so Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Russia, anti-Islamist is an accurate label. This coalition wants leadership that runs Libya somewhat like President Sisi runs Egypt. They're very concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood being in power in Tripoli, Libya's capital. They use that fear also as a cudgel against kind of any enemy or rival, regardless of actual affiliation. But there are actually Islamist currents inside Haftar's coalition too. So a key part of his force includes Salafi militias, which you can kind of label the quietist branch because they eschew their own political participation, but are taking up arms on behalf of political leadership. Switching to the other side, on the anti-Haftar side of things, there's a diverse coalition that falls under the UN recognized government and includes many political factions and armed groups. That's far from a unified coalition. This group includes the Muslim Brotherhood and its political party in Libya, but their influence gets overstated all the time. The Brotherhood has proven politically unpopular in 2 national elections now, and it's not the driving force in Tripoli politics, even as it remains a player. There are also Salafi militias, other Islamist groups fighting on this side too, other political parties across kind of a whole spectrum of political Islam in this space. And as we've seen, especially in the last year, this Western coalition is increasingly close to President Erdogan of Turkey, whose position is pretty well known at this point. So some of the players in this group want to shape Libya's governance in a more Islamist direction. Others don't. What unifies is strong, but what brings together this coalition overall is opposition to Haftar and a variety of other political and economic objectives that animate the Libya war. So those include who controls the oil and its distribution, what the balance of power among different subgroups and regions is, what's the role for people who fought in the 2011 revolution versus members of the former regime, et cetera. So religion is kind of one layer in this very complicated situation. Finally, I've mentioned political Islamists, quietist Salafis, so I'll also mention another current that's present in Libya, which are the rejectionists, the Salafi jihadis, like the Islamic State, Ansar al-Sharia, et cetera. At present, these groups aren't participating in the Libyan civil war so much as operating in its seams and taking advantage of the governance vacuums that the conflict creates. These groups, particularly or most notably ISIS, have previously tried to establish their own polities in Libya. At present, they're too weak to kind of continue that same project, but they remain a latent threat inside the country. So to sum up all of that, Libya has a whole range of Islamist players, violent and nonviolent. Religion's a strong undercurrent in the conflict, but it's not the only driver. And the way that religion plays into Libya's conflict dynamics remains very complicated.
No, that's a great primer. Thank you. Let me shift focus one more time and sort of move a little further west and a little further south, and ask Jacob a question. Jacob, first of all, thank you for joining us from Asia, where it's very late. I really appreciate it. You're a specialist in Africa's most prominent jihadist outfit, what could be called Africa's most prominent jihadist outfit, Boko Haram. Can you, I think it's useful sort of just as a starting orienting point though, to get a little bit of a primer on the group itself. What does it stand for? What are the different factions? Because it's not a unitary actor, right? There's different factions in Boko Haram. What are they seeking to achieve? How do they differ? I think that would be enormously useful.
Thank you. It's also my pleasure to participate whenever, wherever, to have a discussion with all of you. Now, I think in Nigeria, we're seeing two divergent phenomena. The first one, I think we'll have a chance to talk about later in this panel, which is actually the quick decline of Islamism in a certain sense. However, as Elon mentioned, there's a rapid ascendancy, an ongoing ascendancy of jihadism, and that is encompassed by Boko Haram and its factions. Now, Boko Haram, the term itself means Western education is simple in Hausa language, but this is just a moniker that Salafis, who used to be Islamist, but are increasingly not Islamist, called Boko Haram as a means to damage their legitimacy. And that was because they had a rivalry about whether we should just be Salafis trying to establish an Islamic state without jihad or with jihad. And the group that we now call Boko Haram wanted to do it with jihad. And they've been fighting that jihad ever since the government cracked down upon them in 2009. So we're in about 10 years into this war. And now Boko Haram as a movement is divided into three factions. The most active one militarily is called Islamic State in West Africa Province, or ISWAP. That's the acronym. And that one is operating around the Lake Chad region in Niger, Cameroon, and Chad, as well as in Borno State, Nigeria. And something to talk about later is that it technically also encompasses the Islamic State's branch in the Sahel. However, one thing that's important to note is that 5 years ago, the war in Nigeria was taking place in the center of the country. Now it's almost completely just in northeastern Nigeria's Borno State and its environs. ISWAP has undergone changes to become more extreme and more hardline within the past year and a half. In fact, in August 2016, it broke away from the faction of Boko Haram that kidnapped the Chibok schoolgirls, and that was excessively hardline because ISWAP wanted to become more moderate. However, even though it did succeed in becoming more moderate from August 2016 until the middle of 2019, it had a leadership purge, and now it's almost as ruthless as the hardline faction led by Abu Bakr Shekau. And I think one of the reasons for the internal purge in 2019 was that Islamic State was waning in Syria and Iraq, as everyone knows, and it wanted more committed leadership in ISWAP to make sure that this group, which was very prominent, would not abandon Islamic State. And as it turns out, they had a purge, Islamic State supported it, and ISWAP has stayed adamantly with Islamic State since. Since that leadership purge, there's also been two tactical changes since 2019. One is the targeting of Christians is in play because they're not paying jizya, according to their own term, which is tax paid to Muslim rulers. And second is the targeting of aid workers. And they've been kidnapped many times, in most cases locals. Sometimes they've been ransomed, and many times they've been killed. And that's new. Moreover, because of the successful barracks raids by ISWAP in 2019, Nigeria's military moved into super camps to protect towns, like fortresses protecting towns, but this leaves rural areas to ISWAP. And that's why ISWAP conducts ambush after ambush on roadways. So that's the situation for ISWAP. Very effective rural-based insurgency now. Now, the even harder line faction of Abu Bakr Shekau, which we still conventionally call Boko Haram, is not really on the offensive. It's lost a lot of fighters to ISWAP. ISWAP has a global brand. Abu Bakr Shekau was kicked out of the group, and it has a sort of base in the southern part of Borno State, Nigeria, but it's not really able to go on offensives outside of that part of the country. And Nigeria is not engaging that faction so much, partly because it's not as offensive as ISWAP, which needs to keep attacking to get those claims in for ISIS and you get videos out and stuff. So Shekau is basically holed up in the southern Borno, and they do air raids on his bases, but he's not really a big game changer. And then the third faction that's relevant to mention when we talk about the jihadi movement is a group called Ansaru, which is an abbreviation for a term meaning supporters of Muslims in Black Africa. And this is actually a formal Al-Qaeda group in Nigeria that was formed in 2012, again, because Abu Bakr Shekau was too much of a megalomaniac. So they got AQIM, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb's permission to break in 2012. Shekau, at that point, killed many of its members. Intelligence services destroyed some of its cells, but it actually re-emerged in 2020, in the beginning of this year, after several years of dormancy because of all the crackdowns on it. And it's now operating in northwestern Nigeria. So that's the exception. And it's trying to mix with Fulani bandits, just as the way that the jihadists in the Sahel have done. And I know it's a slow process, but they're being very discreet about their operations. They mentioned that in their internal Telegram channels. And what's notable about that, though, is that Ansaru's slight successes in northwestern Nigeria have caused Shekau's faction and ISWAP both to recently put cells in northwestern Nigeria only in the past year. And that's a key dynamic to focus on, because it's the northwestern Nigerian arc that leads through Niger into Mali. And that's a whole different sort of theater of operations to watch out for.
Wow, that was a lot. Thank you. I want to sort of circle back to that when we get a chance and talk about sort of the shifting currents even within those three factions. But in the meantime, let me switch back to you, Ophir, and ask you sort of a follow-on question. So in your introductory remarks, you talked about the Brotherhood and how the Brotherhood figures into Egyptian national politics and sort of, the ups and downs politically that the group has experienced. And I want to draw that out a little bit because, for years, the Muslim Brotherhood has been the most significant religious actor in Egypt. But now, you could still make that claim, I would argue, but now it's also a movement in very significant ideological flux. And it's a flux that's happened over the last several years since the fall of Mohamed Morsi from power. Can you sort of elaborate on that a little bit? Can you talk about the state of the organization? What are the different factions doing? What are the, what's the difference between the new guard and the old guard? I think that's sort of a fascinating part of the conversation.
Yes, you're right, Ilan. The Muslim Brotherhood has been going through dramatic changes during the last years. I'm even not sure we can actually speak today of the Muslim Brotherhood as one organization with one leadership. It's rather divided into rival camps, which find it very difficult to agree. The divisions are everywhere. The Muslim Brotherhood is divided between conservative and revolutionaries, between exiles and the few still operate inside Egypt, between the old guard and the younger generation. Even within the exiles, we see divisions between brothers who are affiliated with Turkey and those who are sponsored by Qatar. And these divisions ensure that the Brotherhood remains weak, fragmented, and much of its energies are consumed by internal disputes. When we can speak of two main camps within the Brotherhood, the first is the mainstream majority camp, which consists of the historical leadership that controls administrative offices in Turkey and London and most of the financial resources outside Egypt. The two most prominent figures in this camp are Mahmoud Hussein, the Secretary General of the movement, and Ibrahim Munir, the longtime head of the International Organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. He resides in London since the late 80s. Last month, he was appointed to replace Mahmoud Izzat, the acting general guide who has been finally arrested in Egypt. This is the first time in the history of the movement that its general guide lives outside the Egyptian homeland, a fact that has detracted of his legitimacy in the eyes of many members living inside Egypt, especially the younger generation. What does this camp say? At least formally, it insists on non-violent means against the regime and accepts violence only as a means of self-defense. It believes in a peaceful, gradual approach of da'wah, for fostering change from below by reforming the individual first and then the society, with the ultimate goal of changing the political system. This camp also keeps the door, at least allegedly, open for reconciliation with the regime. The historical leadership's position of non-violence is driven by religious as well as practical considerations. First, protecting the international image of the Brotherhood as a non-violent group. And second, and the most important, their estimation regarding the low chances that the use of force will bring down the regime. On the other hand, there is a minority camp that includes the Brotherhood youth. Some of these youth inside Egypt are more likely to endorse violent means, including harming security forces. This camp even formed in 2014 two armed groups, Hassam and Liwa Thawra. However, as a result of a successful crackdown campaign by the security forces and the death of their leader, Muhammad Kamal, in 2016, their scale of activity has been quite low in the last couple of years. The Egyptian regime, on its part, claims it's not a real division, but rather a coordinated artificial division of roles, a formal non-violent exile leadership along a violent secret apparatus inside Egypt. Either way, the divisions in the Muslim Brotherhood demonstrate the crisis of leadership within the movement. The youth accused the old leadership in the failure that led to the current state of the movement, as well as in corruption regarding the management of its financial resources. Last month, many of this younger generation criticized the appointment of Ibrahim Munir to the new acting general guide. In addition, some Muslim Brotherhood supporters came to the conclusion that both strategies, either protesting peacefully or using violence, will not achieve the goal of bringing down the regime. In their opinion, non-violent gradualism is blocked by the repression of the state, while violence requires much more military power than they possess. Hence, they try to come with several other alternatives, such as reaching a compromise with the regime, which maybe I will elaborate about it later, focusing on underground activity, making alliances with non-Islamist opposition forces, or adopting the Tunisian model of the Nahda party, of real democracy, denouncing terrorism, accepting the nation state, and becoming kind of a normal party. Two key figures in this group are former Morsi government ministers Yahya Hamed and Amer Darag, both residing in Turkey.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, I do want to draw that out a little bit more, sort of when we do our next round. But in the meantime, let me shift our focus back to Libya for a second, because Emily, I think you did a fantastic job laying out exactly how complex the situation is and all the moving parts. But you left out a big part. So I'm going to sort of press you on this, right? Because it's enormously complex, but it's also not a strictly internal conflict, right? You're now seeing Russia, you're now seeing Egypt, you're now seeing Turkey, you're seeing sort of all these different international players. Can you sort of spend a few minutes talking about those dynamics? You know, who are the different external actors in the Libyan conflict? How are they making it worse, and how are they what do they want to achieve?
I'll start with regional and then get to Russia. I think that's probably the best way to phase it. So one important lens for viewing the Libya conflict is as a post-Arab Spring counter-revolution supported by the conservative Gulf monarchies, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia. You can see their support for Haftar as a continuation of supporting Sisi's overthrow of Mohamed Morsi, for example. This is a regional struggle over geopolitics and the future of governance in the Middle East, and Libya is only one theater where it's taking place. And actually, I'll add, it's not just the Middle East. This competition is happening kind of across parts of Eastern Africa, for example, if you watch how these different countries are engaging, say in Somalia. But going back to Libya, you've got Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, some other allies on one side pitted against Qatar and Turkey in the Libya case and all of these other cases. Qatar and Turkey being the powers that try to co-opt Islamism rather than suppress it like the others do. The UAE has taken a very overt role with military support inside Libya, as has Egypt from time to time, noting that Egypt also has some very real security concerns with its long border with Libya. Saudi Arabia has engaged a bit more in the background, but very much supporting that effort with its partners. Turkey's gotten a lot of the attention lately, though. So Turkey, of course, took on a major role in Libya with the intervention that began almost a year ago now. The regional competition is one reason. So if you zoom back to the fall of 2019, which was a very different world for everybody, what was happening at the time was that Haftar and company, with the support of his backers, were pushing hard on Tripoli, Libya's capital, and Turkey intervened to keep the UN recognized government, the Government of National Accord, or GNA, in power. Turkey has other ambitions inside Libya too that go far beyond Libya. Those include aspirations in the Eastern Mediterranean around resource extraction that have spiked tensions with fellow NATO members, Greece and France, as of late. Turkey has brought in Syrian fighters to join the fighting in Libya, drawing from the groups that it backs inside Syria. That kind of use of Syrian mercenaries by Turkey now extends to Armenia, Azerbaijan in that recent flare-up. So we're seeing Turkey develop a deployable force that it can use to pursue ends across various conflicts while limiting its own risks. I'll note that the mercenary issue inside Libya is kind of everyone's issue now. The UAE, for example, has been supporting putting Sudanese mercenaries into the conflict. So there's plenty of kind of blame to share on that front. Moving over to Russia now. Russia and Turkey are competing across several theaters, looking not just at Libya, but also Syria and Armenia, Azerbaijan now. But the Russian presence in Libya isn't kind of just a Turkey thing, and it predates the Turkish intervention. Russia is trying to reestablish itself as a global power, in part by taking on leadership roles in the Middle East and Africa. The Kremlin's also testing out a new way of fighting wars that also includes using Syrian mercenaries. So they're on both sides of the Libya conflict. And Russia's also been deploying private military companies, notably the Wagner Group, which allows it to kind of pursue military ends on the ground without kind of recognizing any official presence there. Libya is also particularly valuable to Russia because it's a pressure point on NATO and on the EU. And if you go back to the 2011 intervention, Vladimir Putin is particularly sensitive about the idea of NATO interventions overthrowing dictators. And so that example of Gaddafi's fall also resonates very strongly, and there's a strong incentive to kind of reverse the results of that. So what we're seeing now is Russia, through its various partners and private forces, is establishing facts on the ground and gaining influence, for example, by securing key oil sites or military positions in the country, and using that to establish a long-term position in Libya, which is therefore an expansion of the Russian influence and military presence into the central Mediterranean, which would be a shift in the balance of power there. Libya also serves some narrower objectives for the Kremlin, like partnering with Egypt in a bid to peel it away from the US sphere of influence. And of course, there's money, which is a reason that plenty of these players are involved too. Looking at kind of both Russia and Turkey, they lost big on contracts that they had before 2011 that they're trying to recoup. So kind of much like the Libyan players have many different interests at stake, the regional and international players do too. And kind of the issue of Islamism and religion is one of them. And it certainly infuses a lot of the rhetoric that you hear, particularly the media from the states that are taking the anti-Islamist line. They're framing this whole conflict as about preventing the Muslim Brotherhood from taking Libya over. And that conflict is about kind of many more things than that. You have to get below the level of the rhetoric, and religion is part of it, but I'd argue that it's much more about power politics across the region than it is kind of the details of that ideology. And you see that in how kind of diverse the different forces that all of these external players will support is. Their kind of motivations are bigger than who their specific partner inside Libya is.
No, that's great. I'm even more confused now. So perfect. Uh, let me thank you for that, Emily. I think that's a great elaboration on the primer. Let me turn back a little bit to talk about Boko Haram. Because Emily just sort of ended with power politics, so I think it's sort of it's a nice segue to talk about sort of the massive strategic shift that's happened over the last year and a half with the collapse of the ISIS Caliphate in Iraq and Syria, and the reverberations that have been felt by all the groups that previously and some still do tethered itself to the ISIS mothership, so to speak. In our last webinar last month, Katie Zimmerman, Emily's colleague, Craig Whiteside from the Naval Postgraduate School, and Alberto Fernandez talked a lot about the sort of the shifting dynamics and the shifting identification within ISIS now that it's far less geographically oriented and it's more sort of informational and ideological. So sort of this, I think, hammers home the point. Boko Haram is one of those affiliates. In fact, it's sort of one of the most prominent of those affiliates, I would argue. So what have you seen in terms of the changes that have taken place in the group and the domestic religious environment in its AOR, in its area of operations, since the collapse of the ISIS Caliphate?
Thank you. Sure, I'm more than glad to address that. Now, as mentioned in my previous discussion, there was a purge in the leadership in ISWAP in 2019, which brought more committed leaders to power. And that's been very important for Islamic State because although it's not prospering in Iraq and Syria, it is prospering and it has a very committed leadership in ISWAP in Nigeria in the Lake Chad region. So the majority of its weekly newsletter, Anaba, covers are actually ISWAP. And a vast amount of the Amak, short video clips that Islamic State can release are actually ISWAP. So ISWAP keeps allowing Islamic State to show that the Caliphate exists and is expanding because of the vast array of attacks that ISWAP carries out. So ISWAP is incredibly important to Islamic State. If it were somehow to lose ISWAP, it would not only lose out on tons of photos that it gets to release and videos, but I mean, it would also be a huge detriment to its prestige because it really has this very important African province. Now, it's also worth mentioning this Ansaru question. Ansaru is actually the small Al-Qaeda affiliate in Nigeria. And there's nothing more that Al-Qaeda would like is to rebuild a presence in Nigeria that it had back in 2012. And that's why actually the day after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi died, you saw Ansaru issue a photo for its first time in years, just to be like, we're still here. And even before Boko Haram pledged to ISIS in 2015, Ansaru issued 2 videos, despite that it was mostly inactive. So you can see that Al-Qaeda wants to get back in Nigeria, but ISIS has just too committed of an ISWAP province in Nigeria for anyone to rattle that. And then there was this other faction led by Abu Bakr Shakau, who was kicked out of ISIS for even being too extreme. And although he still emulates ISIS, which shows how resonant ISIS's brand is, he copies ISIS in his video productions. He's just out of it, and it doesn't really matter to him. The only other thing I mentioned in the Nigerian context is that you're increasingly having Salafism in Nigeria without Islamism. In other words, no demand for an Islamic State and no demand for jihad. And I think the whole ISIS experience of the enslaving Yazidis and all the mass killings just made the Salafis completely drop jihadism from their agenda. And I think one of the potentially midterm to long-term implications of that is that in the past, the various jihadi factions could basically recruit from among the Salafi population because they were basically saying the same thing 10 years ago. We want jihad, we want Sharia, but the one side of Salafi said, we'll do that basically in the long term. And the jihadis basically said, no, we want it much sooner. But now you don't actually have that other group of Salafis that even want jihad or Sharia. So that might be less of a recruiting pool down the road for the jihadis compared to what they had 10 years ago. At the same time, we might talk later in this discussion about other systemic problems in Nigeria, which will still allow disaffected people who don't like the government to end up choosing Boko Haram.
No, that's a fascinating point, and I think it's useful for everybody to remember, as we've seen in this discussion, that the groups like Boko Haram, groups like ISIS are sort of living, breathing organizations, and they tend to change their organizational methodology over time based upon real world conditions. And sort of that's what we heard last month, and sort of I think you really sort of hammered that home. So speaking of changing organizations, I wanted to sort of to switch focus and sort of talk about where the rubber meets the road, where sort of the Egyptian state has sort of confronted the changing nature of the Islamic State and also of the Muslim Brotherhood within the country. So Ophir, over to you. You've outlined sort of this panoply of changes that the regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi faces. This includes groups that are classified as participationist, right, that want to participate within the existing political system and shift it from within, all the way to rejectionists who sort of want to overturn the table and want to sort of to create something else in its stead. And obviously sort of the Brotherhood for the most part is part of the former, and sort of the Islamic State's Sinai province is part of the latter. But this obviously is a very different, very complex threat matrix. What is the Egyptian government's strategy for dealing with them? And, is it succeeding? Is it failing? Sisi has spent a lot of time talking about counterterrorism strategy. How's he doing?
Yes, as I understand it, as I see it, Egypt understands that its response to the Islamist challenge should not be restricted to the military field alone, but must address also ideological dimensions. While the Muslim Brotherhood is not a solid, cohesive organization as it was before, the religious ideas fueling political Islam still carry a strong message, which resonates widely with many in Egypt and also beyond. Under the current circumstances, the Muslim Brotherhood's main focus is keeping the idea alive. The Egyptian government understands it and works to promote alternative interpretation to those ideas and a corresponding ideology that might be attractive enough to defeat Islamism permanently. As part of this ideological war, the regime strives to promote its vision for Egypt, first of all, as a nation state, a stable, prosperous, and secure homeland, rather than a part of an imagined caliphate. This is true also about the ISIS threat. For example, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, Shawki Alam, ruled a few years ago that Egyptian nation state is not less legitimate in Islamic terms than the historic caliphate. According to him, the caliphate is not a sacred institution derived from religious texts, as the Prophet Muhammad had not commanded the caliphate. Moreover, Islam is not a static religion that demands the restoration of a fixed form of government and return to the Middle Ages. Rather, flexibility is the soul of Islam, and Muslims should choose the most suitable system of government for their time. So this is the message of the regime. Simultaneously, the al-Sisi regime delegitimizes the Brotherhood by portraying them as non-patriotic movement, which is collaborating with enemies of the homeland. Since 2014, it has embarked on a campaign regarding the Egyptian national identity, which focuses on the contrast between Egyptian patriotic citizens who are loyal to their homeland and Islamists who portrayed as seeking to undermine the nation state, provoke instability, and work for external forces such as Turkey and Qatar. While the regime speaks about the dichotomy regimes versus Muslim Brotherhood, and you asked about the effectiveness of this strategy, it's worth mentioning that Egyptian public opinion doesn't necessarily accept it. Some Egyptians reject both camps equally, the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand and the current regime on the other, and dream of a third alternative, for example, a civil democratic state. Finally, there is the question of reconciliation between the Muslim Brotherhood and the regime. There are some voices stemming from the mainstream camp of the Muslim Brotherhood and some of its imprisoned younger members who are actively seeking reconciliation with the Egyptian state in order to release from jail and ensure the possibility for the continuation of the movement in the future. This puts the regime in a dilemma, as refusal to reconcile could lead the Muslim Brotherhood towards more violence, while acceptance means that the Muslim Brotherhood might be able to restore itself as social and political power. So far, the regime rejects initiatives for reconciliation and stick to the strategy of zero tolerance and eradication of the movement. Only last week, President Sisi repeated that reconciliation is impossible with a group that doesn't accept the mere idea of the Egyptian nation state. Recently, a front page of an Egyptian magazine affiliated with the regime showed the Muslim Brotherhood leadership under the title, "Execution is the solution." It's of course a metaphor for the Muslim Brotherhood slogans, Islam is the solution. So for the regime, the Muslim Brotherhood is still an existential threat. The regime understands that the Muslim Brotherhood long-term vision will remain making Egypt an Islamic theocracy, Turkey at best, and Iran at worst. And they wish for Egypt and for the Egyptians a totally different future.
Thanks for that. That was excellent. All right, let me sort of shift over to Libya again. I know we're sort of bouncing around a little bit, but I think this is sort of a useful conversation to have as we transition from the political to the sort of the military to the ideological. So Emily, the tide of the Libyan civil war seems to be turning in light of the last week's announcement of a ceasefire, in light of sort of the shifting tectonic political plates. All of this, I think, begs the question, what are the stakes here for the international community, and what's likely to come next in light of sort of that very complicated grid that you laid out for us?
Sure. So yeah, there are plenty of consequences for the international community here, particularly because Libya's war hasn't been only about Libya for quite some time now. So, first, this I haven't mentioned and probably should have mentioned earlier, there's a humanitarian crisis happening here, both for Libyans dealing with the war and its fallout inside Libya, and the migrant populations that are either passing through the country or stuck in the country in terrible conditions. And so that's something that hasn't gotten much attention from the international community, particularly with everything else going on, but that deserves a lot more focus and has implications for neighboring countries and migration generally, but there's a real humanitarian need there. Second, I think something that deserves more study and some people have done great work on so far is how warfare is changing, with kind of Libya as one of the laboratories for it. And this is something that we should be concerned about with an eye towards how it will shape conflict in the future. So use of online disinformation, drones, mercenaries, kind of all creating a climate of deniability that has consequences for kind of the global order and knowing actually what's going on and who's doing what in the world. The idea of gray zone conflict isn't new at all, but the way that technology is changing how countries can engage in conflict and reduce their own risks while doing so is, I think, an important trend. And there are many players kind of testing out their capabilities inside Libya now. Third, kind of looking from the perspective of the US and its allies, there are some very real geopolitical considerations inside Libya. So, Russia contesting the Mediterranean is one piece. The fracturing of NATO is related to this. Turkey is, for a lot of reasons, extremely at odds with Greece and France. Obviously, some of this is not new at all, but Libya has kind of become one of the wedge issues, even if it's not necessarily the most important one. And these are also not kind of fleeting concerns. Russia, Turkey, and the UAE are setting themselves up for permanent military positions inside Libya, and that'll have repercussions for the whole region going forward. Next, the Salafi jihadi threat from ISIS and other groups is still there. I don't want to overstate it. They've been weakened significantly, but that said, as the war continues and society continues to fragment, I expect to see a resurgence of those groups. I'd love to be wrong on that, but so far see a lot of the same factors that led to their rise in the first place. We've seen similar resurgences in other places, and I'd be surprised not to see that here, particularly as the conflicts become more multi-layered and has gotten extended. If you look at southern Libya, where a lot of those groups are based, they're kind of part of a larger nexus connecting jihadi groups that reaches all the way down, arcs all the way down to West Africa. So that entire region is on a worrisome trend line. And I think we'll see kind of a renewed threat of international terrorism coming out of that kind of part of Africa. All of those implications mean that resolving Libya's war is very important, because that would be a key step towards dealing with any of those problems. And we actually are at a more optimistic point right now than usual as far as the Libya war, with the ceasefire recently announced. Naturally, there are some issues, though. The ceasefire itself was a very general statement to start off, and the difficult questions haven't been answered yet, and there are subsequent negotiations that need to happen, on security issues, on kind of who will be in the armed forces, on the constitution, on the oil. All of those thorny problems aren't solved. And meanwhile, there are armed groups all over the country, some with external backing, that are going to try and achieve their ends or hold on to what they have by force. So there's a high potential for spoilers in a peace deal. And we've seen that before. There was progress towards a UN conference in 2019 when Haftar started his offensive on Tripoli. The UN Secretary General was in Libya at the time. So that pattern's well established. The involvement of external players, including those with forces or mercenaries in the country, has been a kind of vector for keeping the conflict going when it might otherwise have resolved. So, Libyan forces that may have run out of supplies or arms have a source, and now there are other forces that are not even Libyan that can start the conflict again if it serves their interests. Now, kind of all the foreign forces are supposed to withdraw under the ceasefire, but for many reasons, including the fact that there's no enforcement mechanism and that everyone's already making the arguments for why that doesn't apply, or saying that they're not present when they are, I don't expect that to change. So, I'm hopeful that the negotiations do mark some progress. There are other reasons to be hopeful, including some kind of shifts in the Libyan political scene that have brought kind of more negotiators forward. But I'm worried that the same dangers, the same obstacles that have derailed political progress before are still quite strong. And I think the trajectory is probably still going to be negative, at least as far as things stand now.
Okay. Glass half empty for sure. But it does sort of lead me to my last question. And Jacob, over to you. And I think this is sort of what we've heard about sort of Egyptian state response, Libyan state fragility, sort of, I think feeds very sort of nicely into this dynamic picture that you painted of Boko Haram. The last year, the sort of year plus since the collapse of the ISIS Caliphate in Iraq and Syria, we've seen a major repositioning of violent actors into Africa. And actors that are active in Africa to different places in Africa. Flare up of hotspots in places like the Sahel and the Lake Chad region and Mozambique even, and sort of increasing pressure on already fragile states. Can you talk about what's likely to come next on the continent and why?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So in terms of ISWAP, the key thing to understand, as that's the main faction, is that it's actually a classic type of guerrilla insurgency now. You have the army controlling the towns and fortresses, and you have the insurgents controlling the rural area, recruiting, ambushing, and slowly trying to work their way to attack those fortresses. So you could study insurgencies from Latin America to Southeast Asia over the past 100 years and have a general prediction of how this is going to unfold if the Nigerian army doesn't turn things around. And the Nigerian Air Force is probably not sufficient to change the momentum. So right now, you'd say the advantage tilts a little bit in ISWAP's favor. However, as Elon mentioned, you also had Islamic State in the past year really establish itself in the Sahel, particularly in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And they went on a huge upward trajectory from December 2019 into this year. Now, if you also look at some theoretical concepts here, you had AQIM through its sub-affiliate called JNIM in Mali, watching an ascendant Islamic State group in the Sahel. And then, JNIM, had to quickly clamp down upon that. So you had a big rivalry. And part of what made JNIM, which is Al-Qaeda's affiliate in the Sahel, do that clamp down so quickly was partly that Islamic State officially declared them part of ISWAP in around April 2019. So once, Islamic State was formally embedded in the Sahel and the Sahelian jihadists were not just ISIS leaning, you saw JNIM do a crackdown. And that fighting has gone on all the way up until the past few months. And actually, JNIM has been successful in basically repressing Islamic State. So now Al-Qaeda is the stronger group in the Sahel. And I think that's important because unlike Islamic State in Africa, Al-Qaeda has a theory of victory. Whether they get it, we don't know. But just like the Taliban has a theory of victory, the Americans leave, we fight the Afghans, even though we claim we won't, and we'll work it out, and then we win. And then sort of like Vietnam 1975, the Taliban takes Kabul. JNIM is loyal to the Taliban, and their theory of victory in the Mali is one day France needs to leave, we'll negotiate with Mali, even though we'll probably really fight with them, and they'll get some part of northern Mali as their own territory, and they'll give implicit assurances not to do external operations. And that's also important if you look at Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda group, which has also successfully put down the Islamic State group. If they see the Taliban succeed in that, a big question still, and then Al-Qaeda and Mali succeed in that, then maybe Al-Shabaab will say, you know what, this is our theory of victory. We might not get Mogadishu, but we'll win something in Somalia. Now, the final place to look at is Mozambique. Islamic State announced a province there, a formal province in Mozambique and Congo in April 2019. And what's interesting there is that you had small Salafi jihadi movement in Tanzania and even parts of Kenya and even parts of Mozambique for the past few years. But once these groups became loyal to Islamic State around 2018, you saw a rapid acceleration leading up to the formal declaration that they were provinces in 2019, and the groups have only accelerated since then. So it's actually a mystery because it's a very obscure insurgency, but something happened between the formal loyalty to Islamic State and the rapid level of development that has to leave analysts really puzzled. Part of it might be foreign fighters from South Africa. Part of it maybe is the aura of Islamic State. But either way, the most important latest development is that the Islamic State fighters in Mozambique have pushed into Tanzania, claimed their first formal attack there a week ago. And so now you have fighting in Congo, where there was a major prison break last week, right after the Islamic State spokesman promised prison breaks around the world. You have Mozambique, incredibly intense. You have Tanzania. And even if you consider some of the dynamics that Emily talked about, you do have some foreign interests that might end up getting involved, whether it's Russian mercenaries, United States, a Southern African regional alliance. And even if you look at the Sahel, you have the potential for that type of regional dynamics. Turkey's getting involved in Niger. France, of course, is involved there. So when you look 5 years down the road, you maybe can look at Libya as a template for what might happen on a more minor scale in Southern Africa and the Sahel.
Well, that's, I think, a very sobering thought. And it also, I think, really puts a pin in what we've been talking about today. So, this is, I'm cognizant of the time. I know I have many, many questions, and I think you've left the audience very much wanting more. But the macro takeaway that I've gotten from this is that, Africa is a dynamic continent. It's a dynamic continent in the context of Islamism. Things are changing pretty significantly. And the situation, rather than stabilizing, despite all of the sort of political machinations, the situation is actually much more volatile and has the potential to become much more volatile. It's one to watch, I think. So let's end it there. Guys, thank you so much. This has really been a truly excellent discussion. And thanks to everyone who has tuned in today on our live Zoom. As I said, the video for this event will be up in about a day or so on the AFPC website, www.afpc.org. I hope you'll join us there, and I hope you'll join us next month for our next installment. We are I think, trying to travel around the world and talk about how Islamism intersects with global politics. And one of these days, I will get a chance to ask a question about how Islamism is being affected by the coronavirus, but that may be something that we have to deal with another time. In the meantime, guys, thank you so much. Thanks again for a truly excellent discussion.